Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Today we welcome Elaine Howard Ecklund, who's from Rice University. She's actually presently based in CERN in Geneva because her husband is a physicist, and so she's doing active, I think, sociology of the scientific community, but watching all these physicists look for the Higgs boson and not finding it. So that's probably, from a sociological perspective, I suspect quite interesting actually. But most of the time she's assistant professor of sociology over in Rice. In addition, she's also director of the program on religion and public life at the Institute for Urban Research, also based at Rice University. Quite relevantly for the topic today, she's author of a rather well-known book, a book that's become well-known in the past couple of years, Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, which is published by Oxford University Press and is a summary really of her excellent research on the top 21 elite universities in the United States and the scientific community there and what they think about spirituality and religion and so forth. I have to mention also that she's very kindly done 4 talks in local schools here in Cambridge for us in the past 24 hours. So she's really got quite a heavy program. 3 talks yesterday, 1 this morning at Impington Village College, and getting around to discuss sociology, especially for sixth formers. And so we're very grateful to Elaine for not only coming here for the seminar, but also engaging in the school's program. And her topic today is the religious beliefs of scientists, a sociological analysis. Thank you very much, Elaine.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and I don't know whether to think that this is an easier audience or a harder audience than 16 and 17-year-olds, but it's certainly a somewhat different audience. So social science, for those of you who are social scientists, how many of you are social scientists in the room? So we have a few of us, so you'll know what I'm talking about. Often social science idea for a project, a research study, starts with a personal experience, because of course we are people studying the social world, and you could study many, many things about the social world. And I remember the exact moment in time when I decided to study what scientists think about religion. I am trained as a sociologist of religion at Cornell University, an Ivy League school in the States. And I was doing a study at that time on religion and family, trying to understand how religious organizations are responding to changes in family forms, such as the increase in single-parent families. And I was attending a Bible study as part of my research for this project, doing ethnographic methods. And I got into a conversation with a mother who was part of the church who said, what do you do, to sort of making casual conversation? And I said, well, I'm a graduate student getting my PhD at Cornell University. And she said, well, I hope certainly that my daughter does not attend Cornell University. I thought, okay. That's sort of a bit of an odd statement. I would think that most parents would be very happy if their child got into a good, I thought, well, maybe you're hoping for Harvard, And she said, you've heard of Harvard, right? I'm sure. Not as good as Cambridge and Oxford, of course, but we try. So, so she says, well, the reason I hope my daughter doesn't go into Cornell, I asked her, of course, please tell me more, is because I'm very afraid that the scientists there will eat her for lunch, that they will, this is an Americanism, right, eat her for lunch, that they'll be very, very mean to her and take her away from her faith, that they'll tell her and teach her all kinds of things about science that will make it much less likely that she'll be a Christian, will make it much less likely that she'll believe. And then is sort of when, the spark came in my mind, and I thought, that's what I should do. Is that really true? Is that a myth that people have, or is that true? Are scientists out just to take poor unsuspecting religious students and turn them into unbelievers? So I thought, well, I should study what scientists think about this topic, and I looked around in the research and realized that not very much had been done on that topic, and so that started something of a research journey for me over the past 5 years, and something I'm continuing now. I think that as I look around, I've studied this phenomenon mostly in the States, but as I look around, of course, there's controversy in the States over religion and science, and it's really even something of a global concern. In the US, there's controversy over teaching evolution in the public schools. There's controversy over embryonic stem cell research and how far biologists who study stem cells, embryonic stem cells, should be allowed to go, what kind of implications this has for human life and the development of life. In the EU, there is worry, especially in the UK and France, about minority religious groups, particularly Muslim immigrants, and the kind of impact that they will have on science, as well as some other traditional, more conservative religious groups. Will they, as has happened in the States to some extent, try to prevent the teaching of evolution in schools, teach alternative forms of discussion about the development of life on Earth. So these are larger issues. In Turkey, too, which is trying very hard to develop a science infrastructure that is competitive with the rest of the world, there's concern there, too, in an intensely secular state about the impact that Islam is having on science, a growing science infrastructure. And in China, a different kind of concern that some have raised in recent science journals about potential ethical breaches by scientists in China. And is this as a result of an intensely secular state where there is not so much of a commitment to religion? Of course, there's a growing religious populace. Sociologists would tell you in China there's not an official religion, of course. Is there so much commitment to a communist state among the scientists in that community that there's actually more of an impetus towards ethical breaches within the scientific community? I don't know whether that's the case, but there has been some talk of that. Into this, I have several research questions. I think social science methods, and sociology in particular, are especially good at helping us dispel myths about the social world. As individual persons, we have narrow ideas based on our own experiences about what happens in the rest of the social world. And at its very best, I think sociology broadens our sense of what's happening in other parts of the social world that we do not inhabit through our own individual lives. And some of the questions I have as a social scientist who studies the interface between science and religion through the lens of scientists themselves is, how do the religious identities of scientists influence their entrance into science? Is it true that children are very unlikely to go into science if they're raised in especially religious homes? Or are there conditions under which being a religious person, being part of a religious community, might even propel someone into science, might even be helpful for someone who wants to go into science? Also, how do the religious beliefs of scientists influence their applications of science into different spheres of public life? So by that I mean, you learn, I should say as a parenthetical, you learn so much from speaking to young people, don't you? For those of us who are teachers, they're often wonderfully honest. So a student, more than one student in doing these school lectures had asked me in the question and answer period, aren't all religious scientists biased? How could you possibly be a scientist and be a religious person without being intensively biased? So there's sort of an assumption among the school children that to be religious is to be biased. And I was talking to them about various ways, just among the scientists that I've studied in the US and to a lesser extent in the UK, the various ways that scientists might utilize religion in their scientific lives in ways that don't have any impact on how they actually do science, but do have an impact on how they apply science. So, for example, are religious scientists more likely to be concerned about care for the environment? Are they more likely to be concerned about public outreach of their science? Are they more likely to be concerned about issues of what we call social stratification in science, say that certain minority groups, certain social class groups are particularly unlikely to enter science? Are they more likely to be concerned out of a sense of, say, justice that they learn in their religious community about those kinds of issues? It's not that scientists who aren't religious don't care about these things, but is there some moral reasoning that can be found in religious communities that might make one especially concerned about those kind of issues? And third, how do scientists perceive religion and state relationships to influence science? Do scientists in China, for example, where there is an officially secular state, as there is in Turkey, but a different kind of secularism, do scientists in those nations feel that they're hampered in extraordinary ways from talking about religion, or perhaps in the U.S. where there is an official separation of church and state, but an intense amount of religion among the public. Perhaps they feel more hampered, scientists in the U.S., from talking about the science and religion interface. I just don't know. There hasn't really been any kind of cross-national work in this way. And then fourthly, what challenges do religious scientists face, and perhaps what challenges do secular scientists face when talking about religion? I'm very interested to know across different national contexts if scientists feel comfortable talking about being a scientist within their religious communities. Is it popular to be a scientist? Is this a good profession in a religious community? Is it something that one feels comfortable talking about? I found in my US-based research that they do not, but perhaps there's a different kind of condition in other places around the globe. Give you a little bit of background. Social scientists, as any scientists, are trying to always fill holes in research that others have done, right? Add some more knowledge and insight. In the US, there's been somewhat of a concern with the personal religious beliefs and practices of scientists. The early 20th century psychologist, James Luba, did some studies of the National Academy of Sciences in the US, where he asked them questions about whether or not they believed in God, what their religious identity was, and he gave him some fairly limited choices, and belief in an afterlife. So quite old research there. And then Larson and Whittam, historian and a journalist, then replicated that work, and that's been quite widely publicized. And then Rodney Stark, who's now a professor, sociologist at Baylor University, also has replicated that work in his own way. So still, the research, though, is quite old. And I would argue, as I will in a second, that it's narrow in very specific ways. Luba, of course, used that to show that highly successful scientists are not religious, and he argued based on that, he made the inference that as U.S. society learned more about religion, that it would not, more about science rather, that it would necessarily become much less religious. And that has not really happened. Luba, of course, didn't have enough time in his lifetime to continue studying this, but it's something that others have picked up on. Drawbridge questioned British Royal Society fellows on their religious beliefs and found somewhat similar findings as Luba, but also an interest in spirituality. So that 60%, he had a bit of a broader survey, 60% of respondents view some kind of a spiritual domain. There are some limitations of previous scholarship, which you've heard me refer to just briefly. This work is fairly narrow, based in the US and UK. It's also fairly narrow in other ways too. It's old, and there's not very much theoretical understanding of the various ways that religion and science might connect for scientists themselves, even among scientists who are not personally religious. They don't live their lives in a vacuum. In the US, for example, scientists who aren't religious interact with religious people in other kinds of civic institutions. They have religious students in their classes sometimes. So they have to develop some kind of framework or way of thinking about religion and its connection or lack thereof to science. And so it's very interesting to ask a much broader set of questions from a social science perspective about these topics. I do want to say one more thing about that, is that these are also fairly narrow measures of religion. I think Luba asked questions in his early 20th century studies that perhaps well captured the religious populace at that time. But now there's an increasing diversity of religious forms in the US and in more globally. Certainly, those kinds of questions such as, do you believe in God? Do you attend church? Don't describe the kind of diversity of religious practice and understanding that is out there. I gave the example when I was talking to the school children of, how would you classify someone who was raised in a Catholic background, who perhaps now calls herself an evangelical Christian, has a boyfriend who's Jewish and attends synagogue occasionally, and does some New Age meditation practices. So this kind of person, this what scholars have come to call in the States sociosyncretic religion, is fairly pervasive, and very narrow survey conceptualizations of what religion is don't do justice to the kind of complexity that religion has in individual lives. I am very interested in a broader, let me lay out just a bit, a broader research agenda that I have, which is to study religion among scientists and ethics, its relationship to ethics, if there is any, in 6 different nations. And you may ask me in the question and answer why these nations, but just briefly, these nations that are US, UK, Turkey, Italy, France, and China, have very different science infrastructures. They have a different relationship of religion to the state in each of the nations, and they also have a different type of religion among the populace, different conceptualizations of religion among the populace, and so therefore make good cases. It's not that other countries couldn't be studied, but these countries make good sense for the reasons that I just discussed. It's the goal of our research team, which is comprised of those in the different countries, to survey 10,000 scientists, both junior and senior level scientists. I'll talk to you a little bit more about my US-based research, but I think I made a bit of mistake in that research in not doing more study of, say, graduate students and postdoctoral research fellows. It's very interesting to compare very young scientists to much older scientists to get a sense of how the academy is changing, and well as the science infrastructure over time. And in this study, looking at the 2 disciplines of biology, all fields of biology, and of physics, which have both interfaced with religion, but in somewhat different ways. We will follow that up with in-depth interviews with a scientifically selected sample of those who respond to the survey, and do 600 interviews. It's our goal to do 100 interviews in 40 countries. Interviews which are very costly in terms of time and money, but really unparalleled in their ability to help you figure out nuances of the more quantitative data, and also quantitative ways of analyzing textual interview materials. But I'm a big proponent of mixed methods research, where you get a big lay of the land of what's going on that you can do very nicely through a survey, but also you participate in institutions, you send researchers to interview people as a way of understanding what your survey means, the kind of nuances that these categories have. To tell you a bit about the US-based study, some of you have read my book, so I won't dwell on it extensively, but I want to give you an overview for those of you who have not been exposed to the work. Then I will tell you a bit about the findings from a very small study that I did last year, a pilot study, where I did interviews with biologists at Cambridge and Oxford who might be interested about some of the results of that. And then we'll use the results of that pilot study to conceptualize survey questions as part of this larger study, and some of the implications I think some of these results have. So in the U.S., you know who that is, I'm sure, Albert Einstein. I used to have that picture up on my dorm room wall when I was a university student as a way of inspiring me to do good work. And so scientists, he and perhaps had better hair, he's a very well-respected figure, right? Of course, died many years ago, but he's a well-respected figure. I don't think anyone really has negative thoughts about Albert Einstein. But then there's the sense of a kind of scientist who's a more, what I would call, maniacal figure. So you often see this in US movies. There's a scientist who has some kind of potion in a bottle and is going to blow up the world if only given the chance. And they're kind of scary figures. And there is this kind of what I would call in the US, and some scientists tell me this happens in certain corners of the UK as well, this kind of love-hate relationship with science. So in one sense, the US public has a great deal of affirmation of the authority of science. A recent survey done by the National Science Foundation found that 90% of Americans express interest in new scientific discoveries. Now, they express interest in other things even more than science, But there is a general positive feeling towards science. Of course, who doesn't want a better immunization for diseases? There is some resistance to vaccination, but it's not terribly widespread. Who doesn't want a cure for cancer? And sometimes the phrase "studies show," right, is enough to gain a hearing. You see these advertisements all the time. 5 out of 10 dentists surveyed said that this toothpaste is best for you, and people believe this. Right? On the other side, another survey that Baylor University did found among the public that we depend too much on science and not enough on faith. And 40%, depending on what survey results you believe and how the question is conceptualized, at least 40% think that creation ought to be taught in public schools either exclusively or alongside evolution as a sort of alternative theory. I like that picture. It's kind of interesting. You can do a lot if you have a lot of time, just looking at different pictures on the web, can't you? So, and the same survey at Baylor found that 25% Americans think that scientists are hostile to religion. So there's this kind of fraught sense of how these things connect, isn't there, at least if we're to believe modern survey research. I want to give you, Richard Dawkins has been very well exported from the UK to the US, and I want to give you a recent quote that he said in an interview, that religious beliefs are irrational, religious beliefs are dumb, and dumb are super dumb. Just to totally underscore the point. Religion drives otherwise sensible people into celibate monasteries or crashing into New York skyscrapers, which is, of course, a reference to 9/11. And so the public, I think, in their own imagination, the U.S. public, of course, has some reason to believe that scientists are hostile to religion. It's not this fantasy on their part. Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, was on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a long time. And so remember that when 25% think that scientists are hostile to religion, they have some reason for those beliefs. But what we don't know, without good research, is if Dawkins is typical, right? Even for an atheist scientist, he may be atypical, or perhaps he well describes what others think about these topics. So, I realize I never turned on my microphone. I hope you've been able to pick me up okay. So from 2005 to 2008, I started this study in the U.S., and I looked in that study at leading U.S. university scientists, and that's another way that we're going to change the world study, is to look at a broader set of scientists, not just those in leading institutions. So that would be places like Harvard, University of Michigan, Stanford University are three of the universities that I studied for this research. I also looked at a broad variety of scientists, looked at physicists to psychologists, so included some of the scientifically oriented social science disciplines, such as economics, psychology, sociology, in addition to physics, chemistry, biology, political science. I also looked at diverse religious indicators, so I replicated some of the questions that have been included on earlier studies of what scientists think about religion, but then added some of my own questions. So questions like, how strongly do you agree with the statement, my colleagues are open to having discussions about religion? Questions about how religion played out in their own backgrounds, what kind of religious traditions they were raised in, if they had any religious shifts over the course of their lifetime, questions like that. So quite a long set of questions. I have the list in the back of my book if you're interested more specifically. I was also interested in studying both religious and non-religious scientists. There is in the broader world of books quite a few accounts of scientists' lives who both their journey to be non-religious or their journey to be religious, right? And I think those are very good and helpful materials, but that doesn't give us a broad overview of what scientists think about these topics. The study resulted in the book Science versus Religion, what scientists really think. The survey was 2,200 persons. a response of 75%, which is a very high response in modern survey research. And I followed that with a scientifically selected sample of those who responded to the survey, and then flew out to their laboratories and offices, and followed them around with a tape recorder and interviewed them about what they thought about these specific issues. What I found, and what you think about it depends on whether you're kind of a glass half full or a glass half empty person. Is that a phrase we use here? Yeah. And I found that, for example, 30% of scientists call themselves pretty committed secularists. So these would not even be scientists who are agnostic, who didn't know whether or not they believe in God. These are people who've made a pretty firm decision. They're atheists. They also do not attend any religious organization. For example, when I queried them about if they had been to a religious organization in the past year, even to attend a wedding or go to a funeral, times when even non-religious people step into religious organizations, they said no, not even to attend a funeral or go to a wedding. About 50% of them saw themselves as religious. These would be, in this classification scheme, those who have some kind of religious identity and also have some kind of attendance. And about 20% see themselves as spiritual but not religious. Those who want to have a sense of meaning outside themselves, but also outside of religious organizations, who don't find that sense of spirituality inside religious organizations, but they find it in extra-organizational sense. What interviews tell us is some of the reasons that scientists gave for being secular, and there are 3 types of reasons that they gave in their own words for why they have a commitment to being secular. One reason, which I think will come as no surprise to you, is simply that science won out over religion in their thought processes, that they learned more about science, and so they decided to reject religion. Although I should point out that this was a minority reason. This was the least given reason. A physicist who I talk about quite a bit in my book, who I call Arik, these are all pseudonyms, who said that as a child I was infected by religion, but now I am immune. This view is shared by other scientists who were all just astonished at this sort of viral nature of faith-based thinking, which only exists because parents infect their children, and then there is a new generation, and then they go on to infect more. So the biologists in the room will really resonate with that metaphor of a virus, perhaps. So, this is kind of what we think, or what the public thinks, that scientists see the connection between religion and science as being, I think. Another reason was that religion has let them down in their religious communities. So I'll give you a quote from a biologist who I call Evelyn, who said that when I asked hard questions, I was told just to make a decision to believe, and she had been raised in an evangelical Christian community. My experiences with religion was that it was a way that judgment was passed on people who are different. And she went on like this for about 45 minutes. I've just given you a very short snippet and talked about, how she was especially smart and inquisitive as a child, and smart children just didn't do well in these kind of communities. They weren't encouraged to develop intellectually, and just gave me a lot. But this, for her, she decided not to be a religious person well before any kind of formal scientific training. This was more, being cut off from asking difficult questions. And so when I give this material to religious communities, sometimes ask me to come and give talks about my research, it's a particular kind of message to them, isn't it? Another kind of reason that is less often discussed is that religion is simply foreign. And I think this is interesting from the survey data, that 13% in the sample were raised without religion. Less than 3% of the U.S. public right now was raised in a home where there was absolutely no religion. So the U.S. public is a fairly religious public. Of course, there's an increasing diversity of traditions. There's an increasing number of what we call religious nuns, by which we mean N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S. So, that's all increasing, but it's still comparatively small. So a much higher proportion of people like that in the scientific community, in the elite scientific community. Also, for those elite scientists who were raised in a religious home, they were much more likely to be raised in homes where religion was practiced weekly, W-E-A-K-L-Y, where they, there's not a spelling right now, so where they were not, they were perhaps taken to services only on high holidays. They didn't attend, services very, very regularly. And so that's also a different condition from the American public, where most were raised in homes where they, went to a religious organization at least several times a month, as they report when we ask them questions about their condition of religion in their homes at age 16. What about the religious 50%? This is, depending on your perspective, the glass half full or half empty. So there are certainly a lot of individuals in this community who see themselves as religious, but their religious identities are a good deal different from those of the general U.S. public. So, for example, those who self-classify as evangelical Protestant, only 2% of scientists when compared to 28% of the U.S. population. And to pause a bit on the evangelical Protestant classification, when I ask the question in a little bit of a different way, and I ask questions about, what kind of denominational affiliation do you have, what kind of beliefs do you have, I don't ask them to call themselves evangelical Protestant. I just ask them other kinds of questions which we think of as evangelical Protestant classification. So, for example, most people in the denomination Southern Baptist in the U.S. are evangelicals. It's less likely to find people who aren't in that denomination. Then the proportion rises a bit to about 4%, and it's statistically significant. So there's some evidence that they're perhaps a bit fearful of the label. There's a little bit more than that, but still not a lot. The Catholic classification is another one that I want to talk a bit about. So about 9% of scientists classify as Catholic when compared to 27% of the U.S. population. Although that number has risen over the past 50 years, when I compare these data to an earlier study done in 1969 by the Carnegie Commission, which did a survey of all American faculty, and you can actually sort the data, so you look just at the schools that I studied as a way of comparing, and I asked them the same questions that were asked on that survey. The proportion of Catholics has steadily risen. So that's, even though it's less than 10%, it's still a good deal larger than it was. The Jewish classification, you'll see, is the other way around, that about 16% of scientists see themselves as Jewish when compared to only 2% of the general population. And I actually took the ethnic Jews, people who consider themselves to have a Jewish heritage but are not practicing religiously in any way. That does not include those people. And of course, the no religion category, the religious nuns, is a good deal higher than in the general U.S. population, where a little over 50% of scientists in this category classify as being without a religious identity, when compared to only 16% of the U.S. General population. I was also interested, especially for Catholics and evangelicals, how they act as scientists in their religious communities. Obviously, there are not a huge number of them, that are elite scientists in these kinds of communities. So I want to know if this was problematic, what kinds of things they did in their community. A dominant finding was that they were more questioning than they perceived themselves as more questioning than their fellow parishioners. I have a lovely quote from a chemist that I call Tobin, who said that, "I think some of my fellow Roman Catholics might accept many things at face value, such as finding religious imagery in natural phenomena. Being a scientist makes me want to raise objections like, well, does this grilled cheese sandwich really look like Jesus?" So, and I Googled this to see if I could find it on the web, and you can waste a lot of time Googling things on the web. So the outcome of that is this fellow also had a lovely phrase that he used, which is called secret science. The outcome of that is that, he perhaps, tried to talk about some of these concerns with a fellow parishioner. It wasn't, met very kindly. They didn't like him raising such objections, and so he just doesn't talk about it. It's not as if he lies when asked what he does and says, actually I'm an artist when really I'm a scientist. But he doesn't bring it up too often, he said, unless asked directly. And I think the consequence of that, if you're concerned about public outreach kinds of things, the consequence of that is that there is the perception in church communities that there are no religious scientists, when perhaps there are some sitting in their midst that they could draw on their knowledge a bit better. How do religious people in science act? And this too was interesting. They were very concerned that I know that they practice the same science as people who are not religious. And I found this fascinating because I never asked them. So I didn't say, so do you practice the same science as people who are not religious? I rather assumed that if they had reached the post of full professor at a place like a Princeton or a Harvard University, that they had good science practices, at least good enough to be judged worthy by their guild. And so they, but yet they wanted to bring it up, as if there would be an assumption for some that they would not practice the same science. And so we listen very carefully in the social science community when people insist on talking about things that we don't even ask about. Where that came out particularly keenly was among evolutionists. 94% were evolutionists of religious scientists, which is about the same as the rest of the scientific community, so there was no difference there. The other 6%, didn't answer the question. Also, they had, though, what one called a closeted faith. 49% do not think their colleagues are positive about religion when asked what their colleagues think about religion, and 30% did not answer that question, which is a huge non-response for a survey question. So I was keenly interested to follow up on this in the interviews to find out why they didn't feel comfortable responding to the survey question. They said that they were very concerned about how the data might be used, what I would do with it. So it's a kind of hot button issue for some religious scientists. According to a woman I call Janice in my book as a physicist, she said, I think universities are not always very accepting environments. It's really hard to be a religious academic because the public opinion is such that you're either religious or you're a scientist. To say you are religious might mean other scientists would question your work. And so I asked her, well, what happened? When you said you were religious, did you feel like people questioned your work? And she said, well, I wouldn't know because I don't ever talk about it. So there's such a strong perception that to be religious scientist means that other people would be suspicious of you, other scientists, that she just chooses not to talk about it. She doesn't know whether it's really true, but it's a strong culture surrounding discussions about this topic, a strong culture of silence. There was a condition in the research where this was not the case, and I want to bring up this other category of those I call boundary pioneers. They're scientists who are highly religious. They are very prestigious in their fields. They are very open about their religious faith. Jim, a sociologist I interviewed who's not religious himself, said, there are some people with very deep religious beliefs who simply don't let those things conflict. One of the lovely examples is Francis Collins. He's a very serious born-again Christian and obviously a firm believer and manages to live very well with that. And Collins is, of course, currently director of the National Institutes of Health and former head of the Human Genome Project and has written the book Language of God. So he's been very public about his own connections between the connections between his own faith and who he is as a scientist. And the way I got to this finding is we have these 275 interviews. We had students, I had 13 students working with me. They transcribed the interviews, got just a huge amount of text, just well over 2,000 pages. And then I had the students code those interviews for persons that were mentioned often by scientists. And then when we got a person, we coded for whether they were mentioned positively by scientists or whether they were mentioned negatively. And Collins was mentioned the most often in positive terms, even by non-religious scientists who thought that he was doing good things sort of for their, he was a good impression management person for the science community because he was kind of giving them a good name with religious people. So they liked that. They thought Dawkins, on the other hand, was mentioned very negatively by colleagues as someone who wasn't giving them much help with convincing the American religious public that they ought to think that science and scientists are good and have worthy things to offer. What about the 20% that see themselves as spiritual? These are people that see themselves as spiritual but not religious.
By that, they mean that they hold science and faith together, and they also want to have a consistent spirituality. There's the possibility of being spiritual even when one is an atheist, which is something I've written about some in my work because I found that to be such an intriguing finding. And they want a spirituality that makes a difference in how they live their lives, a spirituality that makes a difference in how they care for students, that kind of thing. A quote from a person who considers himself a spiritual atheist, I found that 22% of atheist scientists consider themselves to be very spiritual people, which is a finding that I investigated for quite a long time because it was so surprising to me. Tom, a person I call Tom, who's a biologist, who's an atheist, said that people who have spirituality believe in God and they think of it that way. Personally, I believe in nature, and I get my spirituality from being in nature, but I don't really believe that there's a God. So you see in that quote, he contrasts himself with the general public, people, and their belief in God, and the way, and we find this in survey research in the broader public, that spirituality is always attached to some form of a God. There aren't any spiritual atheists, at least not that we can find through survey research among the general public, but there seems to be some kind of noteworthy condition among the scientific community. I also want to talk to you briefly about a pilot study that I've done over the past year in Cambridge and Oxford, just among biologists, and I'm starting to do some comparative work among physicists as well. We'll do about 40 interviews, and then we'll move on to the broader survey. These interviews will then inform the survey that we're going to do of 2,000 scientists in the UK. So only 22 interviews, but already some very interesting themes. So it's a pilot study, as I said. And we've done a textual analysis of those interviews. So we've had students transcribe the interviews and then analyze them for themes that emerge that we can then test more widely on a survey. I should also say, as a parenthetical, a point 4 that I've written there, which is that there is an intense interest in the study among these scientists we've interviewed, and especially in the comparative research part of it. They're very interested to know how they compare to U.S. scientists, how they compare to French scientists, etc., and that's kind of fun. I wasn't sure if there would be an openness to talking about these issues, and so that's encouraging to me. Perhaps as no surprise to you, there is pervasive discussion of the role of the Church of England in British society, and whether it's a positive or a negative role, what impact it has on discussions about religion in the scientific community. So a biologist who said, you grow up in a society, and obviously that shapes your viewpoint to a certain extent. In this country, the UK has an established religion, and I'm old enough that when I was in school, every day I had to start with an act of Christian worship. And growing up, it's just understood that that's the setup. As another parenthetical, it was amazing to me how much these biologists, even if they were not religious personally themselves at this point, knew about religion, and how much more they knew about religion when compared to their secular scientific colleagues in the U.S. So because they'd had religious education, and so that they at least knew some stuff. Maybe they knew enough to be incredibly cynical, but they had some basic information, right? Which was very different, and I'm going to follow that up. There's also what one called a kind of flexibility of the Church of England. There's a sort of religion for all. As one biologist said, the Church of England is a wonderfully flexible religion. I really like that phrase, wonderfully flexible religion. I think that will be a title for an article or some kind of chapter in a book someday. It can bend any way you like. So that kind of flexibility of the church, some probably don't think of that as a good thing, but this scientist looked at it as a very positive condition, which I think explains something else, how there can be a state church but yet be a very secular society. We have a kind of what sociologists have in Europe have called a kind of belonging without believing. Britain is actually a fairly secular society, this biologist said. I don't see a connection with religion. It doesn't influence policy or philosophy or certainly science in a way that I can see that it has done in the United States. I think they're just completely separate. So he thought, as he went on, he thought the condition in the United States was quite atrocious, which mirrors somewhat the response of a school child, a young woman who was 16 or 17 that I was talking to yesterday, who, when I said, I gave that statistic of 40% of Americans think that creation accounts ought to be taught in the public schools, she just clutched her chest in horror. As if she couldn't believe that Americans could think that. So there's a very different approach, right, to religion. If you think of school children as a kind of British public, right, that was fascinating to me. So I would have gotten a very different response probably if I'd given the same information in a U.S. What we call U.S. high school. There's also, of course, the sense that, this, as I said, the longing without believing is another way of talking about that flexibility. It's a biologist said, I enjoy going to church for the suspension of disbelief, for the theatrical experience, for reading, for the liturgy, for the magnificent stories. But what I don't get, what I found myself just unable to reach, is the kind of communion with the deity. I tried very hard, but I found I couldn't share it. So a different kind of condition that you find in the U.S. where there is more of the assumption among the scientific community that if you go inside a church for any reason, you must agree with what's being said there. So this is a different kind of way of looking at church and what one can get out of a religious community. With that, there was a kind of cynicism of spirituality, and I haven't done enough study to really find out how widespread this is, or perhaps it's a cynicism of the older generation towards the youth. But this scientist said the term spiritual is used a lot more now in general because people want to acknowledge that there's more to life, but somehow they don't know what it is. But I'm not sure, he said in another part of the interview, I'm not sure that I believe it's real outside the established church. So a kind of cynicism of, whatever the spirituality thing is that's floating around outside the established church, not knowing if that's a really useful classification or way to talk about things. And again, I don't know how widespread that is, but that's something we're going to follow up with. I remember one scientist, one UK scientist I talked to casually about this study, said the phrase to me, your evangelical Christians in the U.S. are our Muslims here. Both groups are a problem for science. And I thought that was very telling, and that came out in these interviews. Of course, that's a fairly narrow way to view a whole religious group uniformly as a problem. It's a fairly stereotypical view. But there is a kind of worry about the potential Islamic influence on science. And even within the actual scientific community, U.S. scientists don't think there's any evangelical Christians in the elite science community, and by and large, they're somewhat right. There's a very small minority, but the biologists we've spoken to so far see there being more of a Muslim influence in the scientific community. So there's a biologist who said, I had a Saudi Arabian student once. He was a very, very devout Muslim, but I couldn't get him to repeat experiments. If the experiment didn't work the first time, then Allah was directing him in a different direction. We didn't ever repeat something that didn't work because that was not exactly blasphemy, but it was being arrogant. It was going against the will of God. And so this supervisor who spoke with me was saying, so I don't know what to do with this fellow. I don't want to, appear to be kind of narrow-minded about his religious faith, but this is not good scientific practice. And so he said, I really struggled with that. And he said, finally, we were able to get the fellow through his PhD work, but it was kind of a difficult journey. And then another thing that came up, the last theme that we've analyzed for so far, is this idea that religion as a source of morality, which is much more pervasive in these interviews. Nearly all of the scientists who'd been raised, was in a kind of committed Anglican church experience, had some sense that religion could be useful, had some kind of utility as a moral framework for science. This biologist said, I'm aware that religion provides a strict code of conduct for what is right and what is wrong, and that's a good thing, but I don't buy the God thing and all of that. So and he kind of went on to say, the ways that if you struggle with difficult ethical applications of science, that religion can actually be useful in helping you figure out what those applications are. Well, I think this research dispels some myths. When I give this work in U.S. communities and civic associations, I say, as I said to you in the beginning, that social science can give us a broader view of people and how they live their lives in the world. Certainly not all religion is conservative Christianity in the U.S. 70% of the U.S. population do not identify as evangelical. And in the UK, if we are to believe recent polls, that UK Muslims, some of them are entering science as well, and are doing just fine there. Conservative Christianity as well is more diverse than perhaps U.S. scientists think. If Collins is an indicator of any kind of widespread acceptance of scientific method and ideas in conservative Christian communities, there's certainly a lot of writing in that direction, a lot of active work to try to figure out how to integrate these things. And also, as you saw, the Catholics and the evangelicals and the other religious traditions among scientists who are religious could perhaps be useful to the scientific community in helping them do a better job of reaching out to the religious public. There's also, of course, some myths that need to be dispelled in religious communities. I think a very prominent myth is that atheist scientists are always hostile towards religion. I found very few atheist scientists who were overtly hostile towards religion in the prominent way that some of the new atheists are. Atheists are atheists for a variety of reasons, and that was perhaps a very compelling, surprising finding for me. And also, in their own words, science is not always the cause of unbelief for them. And then I think that there's some kind of myth that's going around in religious communities is that it's simply impossible to advance as a scientist and be a religious person. And certainly that is not the case either if we're to believe social science research findings. And this I alluded to this earlier, but I think the quote from this biologist I interviewed in the States, Evelyn, who said, when I was asked hard questions, I was told just to make a decision to believe, and my experiences with religion was that it was a way that judgment was passed on people who are different, is a very telling sort of wake-up call to some religious communities about what they do in youth education and how they think about making a supportive environment for children, especially highly intellectual children, to ask difficult questions about their faiths in a supportive environment. And then there's a possibility, of course, in religious communities about thinking of science as a type of vocation, a type of vocational calling, and of religious scientists themselves as ambassadors in their communities to think and to mentor youth. I think that's an important thing to think about. And of course, this research has several scholarly contributions. I think in one sense, it complicates secularization theory. The psychologist James Luba thought that there was a sort of universal macro-level societal secularization, and I think a more useful way to think about secularization is not so much at the societal level, but according to different kinds of professional spheres and what goes on in them, and different spheres even of people's individual lives. And we also need to do more work thinking about different professional cultures and how cultures might change. So how about the way that we think about the connection between religion and science? What are the conditions under which that changes over time? How did more Catholics end up in science in the U.S. over time? Those kinds of questions. So I think there's still a few minutes for question and answer if you want to have some questions for me at this point, and thank you for your attentiveness. Can I sit here or no? Yes.
Sort of stand as you like. Please, question in the back. Yes.
So, what happens if you look at university professors in the United States outside science? Do you find the same patterns of belief, disbelief, and so forth?
So there's been some interesting research on that. My own research looked at 7 disciplines in the social and natural sciences, and I did not find disciplinary differences, which was surprising to me. I expected to find them. I found that economists were slightly less religious than the other disciplines, and I don't know exactly what to do with that. But hopefully there are no economists. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say hopefully there are no economists in the room. Well, there now I said it. Yes?
I was interested when you quoted about Francis Collins. Mm-hmm. He simply didn't let it conflict. And I just wondered if there's some information about those who consciously keep it separate, mm-hmm. so it never mm-hmm. conflicts, or those for whom it is not a conflict because it's integrated. I just wondered if that was a
Yes, that's something that I've thought quite a lot about. I wrote an article in a journal called the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, called How Scientists Negotiate Boundaries Between Science and Religion. And so there's certainly scientists who have this sort of Stephen Jay Gould non-overlapping magisterium approach to living their lives, where they attend a house of worship on the weekend and then are scientists during the week, and these things really don't meet in any way. But there's also a variety of, it's probably too short to go into it in great depth, but I would point you to that article. There's also a variety of other ways of looking at it, where they, for example, think that their religious traditions are very relevant to thinking about the application of science, what kinds of communities they care for with their research is a way that one put it. So I think there's quite a varied perspective rather than just conflict, no conflict. There's a whole range of ways that they look at it.
Question right at the back, please. Thank you. Yes.
I'm wondering about the choice that students make what area to study. So, some groups like Catholics, you said, are underrepresented in the US science community. So are there any indication that they choose related subjects like medicine or engineering to avoid a conflict there?
There was an article just about that topic also in the same journal, the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, in 2011 by a young social scientist from Penn State. His name is Christopher Scheitle, S-C-H-E-I-T-L-E. And he analyzed data from a national U.S. survey of called the Survey of Higher Education, which looked at undergraduates and how the kinds of majors that they had when they entered university and what majors they left with. It's a good bit different, of course, than in the U.S. than in the U.K. Our students do a lot more switching around, and so it's perhaps easy to study this kind of phenomenon. The religious students, especially the Catholics and the evangelical students, were much more likely to pick what I would call care work majors, so things like social work, and less likely to pick the natural science majors. So I think you would need to follow that up with an interview-based study to figure out their reasoning for why that is the case, but he was able to show very powerfully statistically that there are differences in choices of major according to religious of the student.
There's a question here, please.
I've got two questions. So the first one is actually related to why these countries, and why not, say, India, which could be quite interesting
Yes,
with biology and yeah. And the second question
Can we
is.
take one question at a time?
Okay.
Yes. So why these countries?
Yes.
So I wanted countries that had different levels of science infrastructure in the two disciplines that I'm studying. I also, you may not think of this immediately, but I looked for countries where there were different gender representations in the sciences. So for example, Italy has a very high proportion of women in physics compared to the other nations in the study. So what is it with those women Italian physicists, you know? So, but we also know worldwide that women are much more likely to be religious than men. And so there is a kind of discussion about that sort of thing that enters in. I wanted countries where there were differences in the religious character of the populace in the country, and also differences in the connection between religion and state. And you want enough in your sample to have the possibility of most different and most similar comparison. So of course the UK and US science infrastructure is different, but it's very highly developed in both of those nations, where in Turkey it's more in a developing state. So, you know, those kind of, I could go into great detail on that, but that's a good question. India would be next on my list.
And a second question.
Oh, second question.
Yes.
I also wanted to know whether you when you've interviewed scientists, whether you have a lot of questions related to the ethics surrounding their own research, and whether you can look at whether their religious beliefs can be fed into their research.
So that's a very good question. A lot of the school children asked varying versions of that question. I didn't find that their religious beliefs had an impact on their research in any obvious ways. Now, I don't know that I would really know, right, for the kind of research that I do, but I think we forget how strong the culture of science is. And there is such we do not want anything, there's such a culture of objectivity that they do not want anything to even appear that anything else is influencing them. Now, does that mean that it doesn't? But I mean, of course not, but they're human beings just like we all are, but the appearance is so great. I mean, they would never overtly say that religion had any kind of impact on how they did research methods. Now, in fact, they bent over backwards. They tried very hard to tell me in every way possible that it had absolutely no impact on how they did scientific research, and I kind of assumed it didn't. So again, there was that hyper awareness of this. I do think it has an impact in application issues, which I've said a couple of times. I do think that, you know, what they do with their research and, you know, say a huge concern for social justice. This one fellow talked to me on and on about social justice in the scientific community, making sure that people from different minority and social backgrounds had the resources to enter into science, and he felt that was very connected to the justice ethic he learned as a Catholic.
Are you aware of studies where scientists switch between being religious and non-religious fairly suddenly, rather than the born-again Christian kind of way of thinking, interpreted in terms of cognitive dissonance and self-perception, those kinds of analyses? Have you come across this?
Can you repeat the question?
So, asked if I was aware of studies where scientists had sudden shifts in religious identity, and you said in the direction of being religious to being suddenly non-religious. I am not. And from my own research, the way that I would access that would be, I did what we call life history interviews, where I interviewed the scientists about any major religious shifts over the course of their entire life. So when they can first remember thinking about religion, when they first remember thinking about science, when they decided they were going to be a religious person, how that happened when they decided they were going to science, how the two connected with one another. And most of them, by and large, shifted to being, if they were going to shift from being religious to non-religious, very early on, well before PhD level scientific training. So I found very low level of religious shift within the scientific training period, at least at the graduate level. I think this does happen at the college level, at the university level. But at the graduate PhD level, I didn't find that very much. It may be different in the other countries.
Please, just here, yes.
In my own biological research, my experimental design is to try and establish one variable and then make a measurement. Now that is clearly vastly different from your own approach. But I'm sitting here just struggling a little bit with the definition of religious. Because as far as I see it, if you just take the Christian faith, you've got religious activity, which can be different from religious faith. So if you go to the traditional churches, a lot of the emphasis has been on attending church. So I would say that's religious activity. And we know in this country over the decades, the attendance at church has diminished dramatically. Whereas if you go to what you perceive as the other extreme, the born-again Christian approach, it's much more about an individual faith based on Bible study, prayer, etc. And I just wonder whether by using the terminology religious, you're not perhaps unpacking the activity from the faith. Is that a fair comment? Or?
Well, let me just address it. So I have written 15 articles from these data in a book, and so I do delve in those articles in quite a various ways of viewing religion, which you can't really approach, of course, in a short presentation. But I'll tell you just briefly how sociologists classify religion, for better or for worse. We look at three kinds of axes. We look at identity, so what kinds of classifications people give themselves. So very briefly, if you think of yourselves as Catholic, Jewish, etc. We look at practice, so what you do, which would be, like you have said, attendance, but it would also be individualistic behavior, say things like praying. And we also look at beliefs, different kinds of beliefs. So, and you may have one of those and not have the others, or have all three of them. There's variation. I appreciated what you said about isolating variables in a biological study, which is practically infeasible in a social science study, of course, because of just the complexity of the environment. We try to approximate that through survey, research, design, and statistical analyses, where through our mathematical models we do isolate individual variables. But of course, in an interview-based, when I use interview-based methods, that's not really possible. But those are good kind of definitional boundaries of how you think about social science that are useful, for me to bring up.
But would you agree that only religious belief is likely to have an impact, if any at all, about a scientist's approach to his own research and his own field of contribution?
I don't agree. So practice, I think we underemphasize the importance of being in communities and how other people shape how we do things. So I think you're thinking about scientific research as only being the condition of the scientific method, where I think of science as the scientific method, of course, but also the community of science, the institutions of science. As a social scientist, I have a much broader view of what all of science is as an institution, and the condition of participating in a religious community, even without believing, I think can have an impact on how a scientist might practice science in some way very broadly construed. But I think we're perhaps mincing definitions a little bit, that you're talking about one kind of narrow slice of science, which is a good thing to talk about.
Final
Yes.
question, thank you.
I've heard a lot of atheists claim that they feel that surveys underrepresent the number of atheists that are out there because of a
Yes.
perceived reluctance to sort of admit
Yes.
they're atheists to a course that they don't know or something like that. So I was wondering if you think that's a genuine effect, and if it is, how do you get around that and measure the true number?
So it depends. So that kind of claim is an assumption about what we call observer effects. So what you're trying, it's another way to think about it is impression management. So the kinds of communities that you orient yourself to. So if your assumption is that, well, the whole religion is, everyone in the U.S., for example, is religious. So if I tell this person who's interviewing me that I'm an atheist, then they'll think poorly of me. So, right, that's the kind of claim that you're kind of making. I think perhaps it's a bit different in the scientific community. I think there's a broader assumption that scientists are not religious, and the orientation in the scientific community is if I tell this person that you're religious, then you'll think that I'm religious, then you'll think poorly of me. So I think I was dealing with a different kind of observer effect, but social scientists right now, at least in the States, are very concerned about that, sociologists of religion in particular, and trying to ask questions in different sorts of ways. There's been studies done, for example, where we try to match the identity of the interviewer and the recipient in order to make them feel especially free, thinking that we're more likely to be honest with people who we think agree with. So there's all kinds of ways that you can sort of get around this, and I tried some of them. I, of course, in my study, which is true, tried to come off as an academic, right? Because I thought they would be more likely to. I stressed all of my academic credentials. I overplayed that, and then I, underplayed any other kinds of affiliations or identities. So there's kind of ways that you think about these things, but it is imperfect, and so I would be silly not to say that it is. But I was very conscious of that, at least.
Great, well, I'm greatly looking forward to having Elaine back in 2 years' time to find out about this great comparative survey amongst all the other countries. But thank you very much, Elaine, for being here.
No, thank you.